Thank you very much, Hans, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're calling in from. As Hans has said, I'm going to give an introduction to the Energy Efficiency Directive. It is a large directive. It's got many different articles in it. So I won't be talking so much about implementation. This is a quick summary of the talk. Quickly, some profiles of energy in the EU and the macro level policy. I'll then be talking about something about the flows of energy in the EU and the barriers to energy efficiency. A quick review of the existing EU energy efficiency policy instruments, and then a discussion of the background to the Energy Efficiency Directive, how it came about. I'll then go through the principal articles, but there's also additional slides which can be looked at after the talk, which are on some of the articles which I don't have time to go into today. I'll quickly discuss something on the progress in implementation, but more importantly, what's happening on the savings level, and then conclude with a couple of slides on gaps in the existing Energy Efficiency Directive. This is from a personal perspective, and a summary of what the next steps are likely to be. Okay, so energy in the EU. Well, the EU imports 53% of all its energy, which makes it the largest energy importer in the world at a cost of €400 billion a year. And collectively, EU member states, I'll use MS for member states throughout this presentation, spend almost 110 billion years each year, directly or indirectly, on energy subsidies. Buildings are the largest consuming sector. They account for about 40% of final energy consumption, of which the majority is in households. And then the transport sector is the next largest with 32%. This has been increasing compared to 1990 levels, although possibly much more slowly than the increase in the vehicle stock. Followed by industry with 26%. That's declined since 1990. And agriculture and others with 3%. When you look at what fuels are being imported or what energy is being imported, primarily it's oil and gas. And so currently 66% of all EU gas consumption is imported, and that's projected to rise, and 90% of oil consumption is imported, which means that many member states, especially those dependent on a single supplier or a single supply route, remain vulnerable to supply shocks. In addition, studies have shown that 90% of the EU housing stock is deemed to be energy inefficient. And yet, despite this, the EU, by any metrics, is one of the world's most energy efficient regions, although there is quite considerable variation amongst member states in that regard. Now, the traditional goals for energy policy around the world have been summarized by the International Energy Agency as the 3 E's. It's energy security, economic efficiency, and the environment. And it's exactly the same in the European Union. The most recent Energy Union public report or paper put out by the new Commission in the EU, which took over in the autumn, talks about a more integrated, secure, competitive, and sustainable European energy system. This has really been the objective in the EU for many years now, and so there is kind of continuation in a policy theme, continuity, I should say, and you do see periodic changes in emphasis somewhat, but the broad gist remains constant. The EU has set itself 3 targets for the year 2020, which are essentially a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels, 20% of all energy supply to come from renewable energy, and 20% energy savings, or improvement in energy efficiency, you could say. Of these 3 targets, the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy that supply from renewables are legally binding, whereas the energy efficiency target isn't. There's been much discussion about this. It's been put forward to suggest that the reason why it isn't binding is because it's by far and away the most attractive means of meeting the greenhouse gas reduction target. It's certainly the most cost-effective, and therefore member states should be wanting to do it in any case. At the EU summit in October last year, EU countries agreed to a new non-binding energy efficiency target of 27% savings or greater by 2030. And there are also renewals and increases of the targets for the other two areas, greenhouse gas emissions and renewable energy. Over the longer term, the EU has a policy objective by 2050 of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions to by 85% or more compared to 1990 levels. And climate change does remain a key driver of EU energy policy, along with energy security and economic efficiency issues. Now, why the focus on energy efficiency? Well, until relatively recently, there'd been very little work done to actually assess how important energy efficiency was on a macro scale for economies. But this graph here shows some results from a study done by the International Energy Agency and released in 2003, which showed and then renewed again a few years later. This is the renewed version. And it showed for the largest 11 economies in the IEA, of which 9 of them were in the EU, the energy savings or the impact of energy savings over time, from the time when the agency was formed in 1973 after the first oil crisis, up to 2004. And what this analysis showed, and it was putting together data on indicators of energy consumption, use, and other factors that allow you to compute the impact of energy efficiency trends, that had we actually been using energy in 2004 at the same level of efficiency that we had in 1973, we would have been using 56% more energy in order to have the same service. And by that metric, energy efficiency becomes the largest single contributor to energy services, more important than oil or gas or coal, and therefore something of considerable value in the overall energy economy. There was comparable analysis done exactly for the EU, but I couldn't find it specifically for this presentation, so I apologize for that. In greenhouse gas emissions terms, this actually results in savings of about 5.5 gigatons of CO2 in 2004 compared to what would have been the case. And at that time, global emissions from the energy sector were around about 25 gigatons. So around about 20% reduction in overall energy sector emissions, which shows that it is an extremely important component of having a clean energy system as well as meeting the other objectives. And yet, energy efficiency faces vast numbers of barriers. Ostensibly, it occurs in lots of different end uses. And first, this generic set of barriers to energy efficiency was prepared by the International Energy Agency and is in their 2013 World Energy Outlook. But all of these essentially hold true. You can see that there is a problem of visibility, and ostensibly it's that energy efficiency is not visible. It is often not measured, and so you need policy measures in order to ensure that it is visible and it is measured and it is accounted for. What the circles I'm showing here will pertain to what the Energy Efficiency Directive has measures in which address some of these barriers. So if you see a circle, it's because the Energy Efficiency Directive has something which is actually addressing this problem. So energy efficiency is not visible to end users and service procurers. There's a low awareness of the value proposition amongst service procurers, so there's a priority problem. That energy expenditure is a low priority. And then you come to the whole issue of the economy and whether the market functions properly or not. And in particular, you have split incentives. Now, there are many forms of these. The classic examples are that a landlord might pay for investment in the building, the efficiency of the building, but the tenant would actually pay the energy bill. And so the landlord has little incentive to reduce the energy bill of the tenant unless they can recoup that in higher rental values. Another example is that you'll see that the accounts of the capital investment account for organisations is managed separately from the operations and maintenance budget. And so the benefits of energy efficiency investments, which might require greater capital investments, would actually be seen in the manager of the operational and maintenance budget, not in the manager of the capital acquisitions budget who would be making the investment. There are many types of split incentives of this kind. There is scarce investment capital or competing capital needs. You have capacity problems, particularly limited know-how on how to implement energy-saving measures. And equally important, because administration is extremely important and policy is extremely important to make the market function for energy efficiency, is limited government resources to support implementation, and even in many cases to develop and implement policy. And then you have problems of fragmentation, particularly in the supply chain, separation of energy supply and demand business models. And the Energy Efficiency Directive includes provisions which help address all of these barriers I've indicated here in circles. Now, currently there are 4 principal energy efficiency directives in the EU, and there are others which have an impact on energy efficiency but are not classified as energy efficiency directives. The 4 principal ones are the Eco-Design Directive, which essentially sets or gives authority to the Commission to be able to, and Member States to be able to set minimum energy performance standards for energy-using equipment and energy-related equipment. There's the Energy Labelling Directive, which allows labelling of some forms of energy-related equipment. There's a directive on the energy performance in buildings, which enables, has a number of provisions to improve the energy efficiency of buildings, but particularly in areas such as strengthening building energy performance codes, and in terms of having visibility through energy performance certificates. And then there is the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is, although I've put it adjacent to these, to some extent it could actually go underneath them, because it's really quite a catch-all directive which includes topics or intends to address areas which are not addressed in the other directives. Now, there are also other directives, as I mentioned, which may or may not be termed as energy efficiency directives, but ostensibly have a large impact on the energy efficiency in the sectors they concern. In the industrial sector, there's the EU emissions trading system, which is basically the cap and trade scheme for carbon, which imposes a value on carbon. And the principal way that industry will seek to meet that requirement is through investing in energy efficiency. There's an industrial emissions directive, which also affects emissions from the industrial sector. But also, as we'll see, the energy efficiency directive also includes a number of provisions which address the industrial sector, the EED, that's the acronym I'll use for it, and particularly for SMEs and for parts of industry which are not actually covered directly by the EU ETS. The power sector is subject to the EU ETS, and then in the transport sector there's a number of regulations which affect the CO2 emissions from vehicles. The most important one being the one for cars and vans, which has had quite a strong impact on the emissions from vehicles and hence indirectly on the fuel economy of vehicles. But there's also more work ongoing on developing measures for heavy-duty vehicles, and there's a communication and new activity for maritime transport. So there are other areas which are being affected in the transport sector. And then lastly, there is a labelling directive for tyres to improve the rolling resistance of tyres and hence improve the energy efficiency of vehicles. So if we put these measures against the different energy-using sectors, the residential, services, industry, transport divided between passenger and freight and others, you can see where these different directives fit. And underneath you've got the Energy Efficiency Directive, which crosses the residential services and industrial sectors and actually does include a little bit in the other sector on the far right as well. Okay. Now, it's instructive also to have a look at how energy is transformed in the EU and where it's finally used. And this graph you can see here is actually the result of an awful lot of different studies and investigations into energy consumption in the EU over many periods. And what it shows you is that in the, I don't have a pointer on here, but on the top left quadrant, you have the energy losses from transformation in the power sector. So this is just losses due to energy inefficiency in power plants. Then you have the electricity produced underneath it, which is less than the value of the losses, and goes to all of these different end uses, which are shown in that quadrant. Broken down, you'll see that you have lighting, motors, electric water heaters, etc., all these different end uses. And then along from there, in the red, you have the heat sector, and the heat is broken down into low temperature heat, medium temperature, and high temperature. The low temperature heat is almost dominated by space heating, but also hot water and cooking, and that's nearly all in the building sectors. And then you have further to the right, you have high temperature, medium temperature heat, which will be going through to industrial processes primarily. And then the top right quadrant, you have the transport fuel consumption, and you have below that you have losses from heat losses. So this kind of map is very helpful for trying to understand where the opportunities are to intervene and how important they are when you're prioritizing them to introduce energy savings measures. Now, to give you some background on the Energy Efficiency Directive, it began with the first European climate change program, which established a goal of identifying and developing all the necessary elements for an EU strategy to implement the Kyoto Protocol. This involved the development of a number of working groups in the period of 2000 to 2004, and I was personally involved in some of these. It included representatives from the Commission's different DGs and their member states, industry, environmental groups, and consultants like myself. And then it was revised with a second climate change program in October 2005. Now, coming out of one of the working groups was a proposal to develop an energy services directive that would promote demand-side efficiency by removing barriers that are currently preventing, or at that time were preventing, the proper functioning of the market for goods and services related to the efficient use of energy. This led to the issuance of the Energy Services Directive in 2006. And this had a number of provisions, many of which have been carried over to the Energy Efficiency Directive, so I'll quickly just talk you through these. It included the establishment of non-binding savings targets on member states in terms of annual reductions in energy intensity of final demand, and set a target of 9% savings over 9 years. It also included a derivation of a methodology for determining this. It had provisions for member states to draw up programs and measures to improve energy efficiency, but importantly to appoint an agency to oversee delivery. It also had measures to address energy efficiency improvement in the public sector, and measures to ensure energy distributors and retailers offer energy services audits or energy efficiency funding mechanisms, and abide either by voluntary agreements or schemes such as white certificates. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these in a minute. The different articles described in here, you'll see availability information, availability of qualification, accreditation, certification schemes, financial instruments for energy savings, energy efficient tariffs and other regulations for net-bound energy, funds and funding mechanisms, audits, metering and informative billing of energy consumption, and the requirement for member states to submit what were called Energy Efficiency Action Plans, EEPs, every 3 years, beginning in January 2008, then 2012, then 2014. And much of this has carried over to the Energy Efficiency Directive. In addition, there was a directive on combined heat and power called known as the CHP Directive, number 2004 ATC. And when the Energy Efficiency Directive was developed, or finally issued in 2012, it combined measures in the ESD, the Energy Services Directive, and the CHP directives into one directive. And it's replaced both of those previous directives, so they were both repealed. The motivation for moving to the Energy Efficiency Directive was an evaluation of the progress with the Energy Services Directive, which found that member states were behind what had been hoped would be the case in their implementation. And so the measures were brought forward into the Energy Efficiency Directive and strengthened in some key regards. And this was through an evaluation that was done in 2011 as part of something called the Energy Efficiency Action Plan. It was issued in the same year. So the actual Energy Efficiency Directive itself addresses all of these different areas on here. It includes the EEPs have been replaced by the terminology NEEPs, which is National Energy Efficiency Action Plans. They have, in place of the softer targets before and voluntary targets, a big key change is the introduction of energy efficiency obligations on energy suppliers and distributors. There is also stronger requirements on building renovations and public sector buildings, fleshing out of the measures for SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and energy audits, public procurement requirements, metering, billing, and information requirements, bringing in the components from the CHP directive. There are heating and cooling measures affecting district heating and cooling, combined heat and power, cogen, microgeneration. There's articles addressing energy services, such as energy performance contracting and ESCOs. There's also articles on the transformation, transmission, and distribution of energy, and on training, accreditation, and certification of funding and financing. So I'm going to focus mostly on the highest hitting or highest impact measures within the directive. But you will find, as I mentioned, additional slides at the end which will discuss the other articles, which I don't have time to go into at the moment. So firstly, Article 4 on building renovation strategy. Essentially, this is important because it requires member states to establish a long-term strategy for mobilizing investment in the renovation of the national building stock. Now, given that the 40% of all energy consumption in the EU occurs in buildings, and that, as was mentioned earlier, 90% of the building stock is deemed to be inefficient, this is an area where there is considerable potential for the EU to reduce its energy consumption, improve its energy security, and meet its climate change objectives. And so there has been a lot of focus on this. Now, the measures you'll find in the Energy Efficiency Directive are intended to be complementary to the measures which are in the Energy Performance and Buildings Directive, which, as I mentioned previously, mostly focus on minimum energy performance standards for new buildings and after renovations, and also on energy performance certificates to make the efficiency of the building visible to end users and stakeholders. So the strategy comprises an overview of the national building stock, identification of cost-effective approaches to renovations relevant to the building type and climate zone, policies and measures to stimulate cost-effective deep renovations, including staged deep renovations. And what is meant by deep renovations is renovations which produce significant improvements in energy efficiency. And this should be differentiated from much lighter measures which might have shallower savings but less long-term savings, and are usually easier to implement, but will not access the full economic potential from energy efficiency savings over the lifespan of the building. There's also a forward-looking perspective to guide investment decisions, and an evidence-based estimate of expected savings and wider benefits. And all of this was to be published by April last year. Article 5 concerns the exemplary role of public bodies buildings. and the key requirement is 3% of the floor area occupied by central government should be renovated each year to meet at least minimum energy performance and building directive code levels. So this essentially means that the central government building stock is used as a catalyst and exemplar for how to meet these higher energy performance requirements which are being introduced in progressively much tighter building energy performance codes. They can, as is true of many of these articles, that member states can actually opt for an alternative approach whereby they take other measures which might involve deep renovations and might involve measures for behavioural change, but they would have to be demonstrated to achieve equivalent savings in central government buildings by 2020. And they should also, there's provisions that they should also encourage public bodies in other parts of the public sector, i.e. at the regional and local level and social housing. And this is obviously a much larger proportion of the overall building stock, to adopt energy efficiency plans, implement energy management, make use of energy service companies and energy performance contracting to finance renovations and implement energy efficiency plans. But this provision is a much softer requirement. It's essentially encouragement, but it's not it doesn't really define exactly how much effort or what the level of effort should be. Article 6 concerns purchasing by public bodies, and this is again requiring that central governments should only purchase product, service and buildings with high energy efficiency performance, and that they would again encourage other parts of the public sector to do likewise, although there's no obligation on the other parts of the public sector to do likewise, and encourage ostensibly green public procurement across the public sector. Article 7, and this is probably the most significant article, or certainly one of them, concerns the development of energy efficiency obligation schemes. And under this, member states have to set up an energy efficiency obligation scheme to ensure that energy distributors and or retail energy sales companies achieve a cumulative end-use efficiency savings target by the end of 2020, which is at least equivalent to achieving new savings from each year from January the 1st, 2014 to 31st December 2020 of 1.5% of the annual energy sales to final customers. Now, this is a cumulative annual savings requirement, so it results in a requirement to have savings of over 10.5% by 2020. Or it would do if that's where all the provisions were in this. And that is obviously a very significant requirement, and it is mandatory. However, there are certain exclusions or exemptions that can be put into this. So they can exclude from this calculation of all or part of the sales by volume of energy used in industrial activities and of transport fuels. And they can also allow savings achieved in energy transformation, district heating and cooling infrastructure, distribution and transmission sectors, or due to actions implemented since December 2008 to count towards the target's attainment. And in fact, what we see is that just about every single member state has taken advantage of these exemptions in the plans they've put forward. And so, on average, the savings target is reduced by 25% over what the headline figure seems to be. Along with this, the member states are required to publish the energy savings achieved by each obligated party annually. Now, the savings to be achieved under this obligations that are among the final customers, and they can be either designated by the member states in how it's to be done, or they can be done through certified savings stemming from other parties. Now, this means things like white certificate schemes where energy savings are certified, can be delivered by all sorts of different actors, but they they then, through a certified process by which there is a measurement, control, and verification system to determine what the levels of savings are from the measures done, and then they can be sold in the market to the obligated parties. There is an obligation for member states to put in place a measurement, control, and verification system in order to verify the savings that are being delivered. But as was the case in one of the previous articles, there is an opt-out clause which allows member states to use an alternative approach to energy efficiency obligations. In other words, they don't have to implement the energy efficiency obligation, providing they take other policy measures to achieve energy savings amongst final customers, which provide equivalent savings to what would be required under the energy efficiency obligation scheme. And these could include taxes, financing schemes, financial incentives, regulations or voluntary agreements that stimulate the adoption of energy efficiency technology and techniques, standards and norms that also improve the energy efficiency of products and services, labeling, training and education. Providing these measures are additional to obligations which are already current under EU law. In other words, you cannot claim the benefit of, say, for example, the measures in the Eco-Design Directive as part of this contribution towards this target. This map shows you the status of utility energy efficiency obligation schemes, or distributor energy efficiency obligation schemes to be more precise. And you can see here which countries are doing what, as reported in their National Energy Efficiency Action Plans and their submissions under this article. And you can see that where a country is in blue, which is Denmark, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, that they are implementing this article purely through energy efficiency obligations. Where they are in green, you can see that there's Finland here, Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, sorry, it's not Austria, it's Czech Republic, excuse me, Croatia, Romania, Greece, Cyprus, and Portugal, that they will be doing or realizing this article purely through alternative measures, so there will be no energy efficiency obligation scheme in those countries. And the countries in yellow, which are all the rest, are combining their obligations under this article with a mixture of energy efficiency obligation schemes, so that means they have set up such schemes in the country or are going to, and through alternative measures, so they've got a hybrid approach. Article 8 concerns energy audits and energy management systems. Now, although energy management systems are actually said here, really the article concerns energy audits much more than energy management. It requires for member states to promote the availability to all final customers of high-quality energy audits, which are cost-effective and are carried out in an independent manner by qualified and/or accredited experts. And this has to be done in accordance with qualification criteria, or alternatively implemented and supervised by independent authorities directed under national legislation. There needs to be the establishment of transparent and non-discriminatory minimum criteria for the audits to guarantee their quality, and the development of programs to encourage SMEs to undergo energy audits and to subsequently implement the recommendations from these audits. Remember, bear in mind that development of programs to encourage is not the same as they shall do it. It is not binding on SMEs. They can also set up support schemes from SMEs to help promote the implementation of these measures, and also develop programs to raise awareness amongst households about the benefits of energy audits at the domestic level through appropriate advisory services. For enterprises which are not SMEs, so many of those would be covered by, for example, the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, they're actually required to conduct an energy audit by the end of this year, and then thereafter at least every 4 years from the date of the previous energy audit. This can be part of a general environmental audit, and they don't have to do this if they already have an environmental management system in place or energy management such as ISO 50001. But this is a mandatory requirement, however, so it is a tougher requirement than was the case for SMEs. Coming on to the provisions for metering, member states essentially to ensure that meters accurately reflect the final customer's actual energy consumption and provide information on actual time of use. Furthermore, those member states implementing intelligent metering systems and rolling out smart meters for gas and electricity need to ensure that the objectives of energy efficiency and benefits for final customers are taken fully into account when establishing the minimum functionalities of the meters. And this is in accordance with a different set of directives which are indicated here. But there is an overlay from the Energy Efficiency Directive onto the requirements within those directives. And lastly, to ensure that the meters are able to account for electricity sold back into the grid from the final customer's premises. For billing, it's essentially the requirements to ensure that the billing information is accurate and based on actual consumption, and that the bills are accessible for free, this information, and that the format used is easily understandable and enables customers to compare deals on a like-for-like basis. So it's essentially more accuracy and transparency in billing. There's a requirement or an article on customer information which promotes and facilitates an efficient use of energy by small energy customers by stimulating provision of information on a range of different areas as indicated here. And then there is the promotion of energy efficiency in the heating and cooling sector, which essentially requires by the end of this year for member states to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the potential for the application of high efficiency cogeneration and efficient district heating and cooling, to carry out a full cost-benefit analysis, which will indicate the economic feasibility and technical suitability of adopting more cogeneration, district heating and cooling in essence, and then to take adequate measures for all of the viable systems identified and cost-effective systems identified to be implemented. Article 20 addresses energy efficiency national funds, financing and technical support, and essentially requires member states to establish financing facilities for energy efficiency improvement measures. If they already have them, they can adapt them. If they don't have them, they need to establish them. They can do this by through setting up national energy efficiency funds. The directive says energy efficiency national funds, but seems slightly inappropriately worded. But also obligated parties under Article 7, under the energy efficiency obligations, can donate to these funds by way of meeting their obligations. So there is an opportunity for them to comply with their requirements through this route. And furthermore, member states can use the revenues from emissions allowances under the EU ETS scheme to count towards the improvement of the energy performance of buildings through this article. And then lastly, you have a reporting article, which is extremely important because it's building on the Energy Services Directive. It requires member states to establish and submit to public scrutiny national energy efficiency action plans every 3 years. The last one was due in April last year, so it's slightly changing the frequency over the Energy Services Directive, which had it due for 2015. And these ostensibly indicate all the ways that the member states are going to meet the provisions underneath this directive, but also what they're doing to implement the other energy efficiency directives as well. And it includes estimates on how well they're progressing towards meeting their energy savings target towards the 2020 requirement of a 20% energy savings by 2020, which is expressed, by the way, in terms of a fixed amount of primary energy or alternatively final energy that the EU and hence each member state has to meet by 2020, although under the Energy Efficiency Directive, member states have an opportunity to do that in terms of energy intensity improvements if they would so choose as well. So what's the progress then towards implementing these measures? Well, funnily enough, the review of the Energy Services Directive was actually only issued in January of 2014, and it was late due to the late issuance of the Energy Efficiency Action Plans by the member states. There are two sets of energy efficiency action plans have been issued by that time, and within them, the second set reported measures on extensive building renovation programs by 17 member states. Several member states using EU funds as well as the revenues from emissions allowances towards energy efficiency measures. It found that some member states included and hence were double counting the impacts from other energy efficiency directives such as eco-design and energy labelling. At that time, it found that 5 member states were operating energy efficiency obligation schemes and 2 more were pending, although with the most recent submissions for the 2014 National Energy Efficiency Action Plans, it's currently 16 member states with energy efficiency obligations, 10 with alternative routes and 2 which hadn't reported. And several member states indicating the provision of model contracts for energy services and the introduction of legislation to open energy services market in the public sector to ESCOs, which actually some member states had regulations in place prior to this, which essentially meant the ESCOs couldn't really work with the public sector. And so there's been progress towards removing those barriers. In the industrial sector, that intermediate savings figures had shown that economic growth had a significant influence on energy efficiency progress in that sector. But the prolonged period of recession experienced from 2008 and the financial crisis had essentially resulted in lower than expected rates of energy savings in this sector. That was what was reported in the 2014 evaluation. Rather modest progress under the terms of the CHP directive. An overall evolution of production shows a moderate increase of high efficiency cogeneration, but nothing spectacular. Now, with the Energy Efficiency Directive, currently 27 National Energy Efficiency Action Plans have been submitted, and 1 member state is still not submitted. And 19 annual energy reports submitted, and 28 responses, so all of them have submitted responses now with respect to the energy efficiency obligations, which I think contradicted what I said a minute ago. I said 27. It depends which site you go on as to whether it's 27 or 28, so I think it must be 28 now. How much energy is being saved due to the Energy Services Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive? Well, the 2014 evaluation of the Energy Services Directive showed that final energy savings for 2010 were 35% higher than the sum of the intermediate savings targets have been. So they were exceeding their target by 35%. And the declared savings level varied quite a lot between different member states. But also it was found that the indicative targets for 2016 reported by the member states were to exceed the minimum requirement by about 40%. However, the evaluation also showed that this was just the headline figures, and a lot of these savings were due to counting measures which were actually due to other policies. When we look at energy efficiency and trends in general across the European Union, and there's different ways of accounting for these, it would be the subject of an entire talk in itself. It's been found that energy efficiency across the EU 28 has improved by 25% at an average of 1.3% per year since 1990 to 2012, with the biggest improvements in the industrial sector of 1.7% per year and households of 1.5% a year. Half of the energy gains achieved through high efficiency in the household sector had actually been offset by an increasing number of equipment and appliances and by larger homes. So, as you'll often find, energy efficiency improvements are actually fighting in total energy consumption terms against underlying trends which might be driving demand up. And that 1/3 of the total savings in space heating in the residential sector was due to new building codes, and that buildings constructed in 2012 were using 40% less energy than those built in 1990. The building codes are actually tightening again over that, so we would expect to see this percentage savings improve dramatically on those figures in subsequent years. Here you can see the tracking and the improvement of energy efficiency against 1990 levels, which is indicated as 100 by sector. You can see that least progress was in the transport sector, which was at about 85% by 2012 of the 1990 levels. And the most improvement was in the industrial sector, which is about 68%. And you can see the different plateaus of the industrial sector, that quite a sharp improvement from 2004 to 2007, and then the plateauing out during the financial crisis, and a slightly slower rate since then, probably stimulated by the ongoing economic crisis in Europe and hence reduced investment in energy efficiency. This graph shows, and there are many more of these types of graphs you can look at, and you can see it on this site here, energy efficiency improvement trends since 2000. If you look at where it says Lithuania, you've got the Lithuanian data as a bar chart, but above it in the line chart, you have the improvement in energy efficiency of the EU as a whole. And you can see reasonably constant improvement going on, slightly faster rate up to 2007 than was true from 2007 to 2012. So there's basically been overall a 15% improvement to 2012 compared to by the year 2000. And when you look at the map shown above, you can see that some member states are doing better than others. So those coloured in dark blue have improvements of over 20%. And interestingly, they're sort of my own country, the UK, but also the new member states in Central and Eastern Europe seem to be doing quite well. Many countries in the middle, in the sort of 15 to 20 region, and a number in the 10 to 15, and just one or two in the 5 to 10 range. So, according to the energy efficiency communication issued by the Commission in the summer last year, the evaluation of all of the different energy efficiency action plans and modelling exercises done by the Commission, and taking into account all the other measures which are in place, the Commission is now estimating that the community is on target to meet energy savings of 18 to 19% by 2020. In other words, it's going to miss the target by 1 to 2% unless things are strengthened. However, the same review concluded that if countries simply implemented the existing legislation on energy efficiency, i.e. properly implemented the measures in the EED and the other directives, that the 20% target would be reached without additional measures. So really this is a matter of implementation to get to the 20%. We can see some more headline figures here. For example, more efficient appliances are expected to save consumers 100 billion annually euros by 2020, at an average of just under 500 euros per household on their energy bills. And the EU countries are rolling out 200 million smart meters for electricity and 45 million for gas by 2020, which is the vast majority of the electricity meter stock. What about the co-benefits? Well, there are many co-benefits. This doesn't report on any of them by any means. Ostensibly, For every 1% improvement in energy efficiency, the Commission's estimated that EU gas imports will fall by 2.6%, which is extremely important for energy security purposes. Gas is probably the primary concern. There's also lower energy costs for people who live and work in energy efficient buildings, improved air quality, improved health benefits, reduction of noise, better thermal comfort, a whole range of co-benefits, and actually improved productivity as well, which is very interesting from a economic development perspective. There's also considerable business opportunities that have been identified for European companies operating in the construction sector and the equipment production sector, as well as the services sector. And there are new jobs being developed through these measures. Generally, the energy efficiency measures are much more employment intensive than energy supply measures. So any activity which serves to move wealth from energy supply and extraction sector to the demand reduction sectors through higher efficiency equipment, services, buildings, etc., and industry is likely to stimulate job creation. So what are the gaps then? What is not covered in the directive? Well, principally the fact that the energy efficiency improvements are still voluntary and not mandatory, with the exception of the energy efficiency obligations. A lot of the measures are still rather qualitative and open to interpretation as what the level of effort should be for implementing them. And this is certainly an area which could be looked at in the review of the directive. Doubts remain about the strength and integrity of the monitoring, verification, enforcement process, and in the energy efficiency indicators tracking progress, and so there's certainly room to strengthen these. Everybody assessing this agrees that the building refurbish rates appear to be too slow and are liable to be too shallow to keep pace with the post-2020 energy efficiency objectives, so there's scope to further strengthen these. It's also true that the existing energy efficiency directives, not just the EED, but the whole suite of them, while they address energy efficiency of equipment, they are not so good at addressing the energy efficiency of equipment systems, such as heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems, motor systems, controls, lighting. And so there is scope to improve the impetus or stimulus for efficiency in those systems under the existing policy measures. As I previously mentioned, the measures addressing energy audits tend to take a rather sort of to make a little bit of a leap of faith that having an audit will be a sufficient stimulus to actually result in energy management outcomes. And experience suggests that that is unlikely to be the case. And so there's a lot that could be done to strengthen energy management as opposed to just having the information from audits. And while smart meters are very welcome, their benefit costs are only just favourable. They're seem to produce benefits about 30% greater than their costs. Studies have shown that there are much greater savings potentials, much more cost effectively in areas such as building automation and control. And these have considerable savings potentials which are not yet addressed by any of the existing directives very directly. So just to conclude then with the next steps, the new Commission's Energy Union paper asserts that improving energy efficiency is the highest priority for the energy sector. And they, as part of this, they're committing to review all of the existing energy efficiency directives. The Eco-Design and Energy Labelling Directive and the Energy Performance are going to be reviewed this year, or completion of their review, because there's already been activities undertaken to support that review. And the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Energy Performance and Buildings Directive are going to be reviewed in 2016. And this will obviously be an opportunity to learn on the implementation experience and potentially strengthen the provisions. And lastly, just to mention that the Commission has held a major conference recently on heating and cooling, and are in the process of preparing a heating and cooling strategy to be issued later in the year, which will presumably build on, amongst other things, the measures in the EED concerning cogeneration, combined heat and power, etc. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I hope this has been informative for you all, and now I think we can open the floor to your questions.